Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
There was a stream of wounded soldiers coming out of the woods. One man I noticed was holding on to his stomach in an effort to hold in a large wound that was allowing his intestines to spill out. Quickly, a frontline medic came up and helped the man lie down and put on a large bandage around his stomach and then injected him with morphine. An old sergeant told me to lie low behind large rocks and then move towards the last German artillery shell blast. He said that was the safest thing to do since the German gunners always turned the crank on their gun a few notches to hit another position. I did run into the last shell burst, and the next landed 30 yards away. This was life-saving advice. Private Arthur S. Couch, 1st Infantry Division.
Well, welcome everyone to this special two-part edition of We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA with myself, Al Murray, James Holland, and as you just heard there, John McManus. And we are talking in these episodes about the epic 88-day battle, the struggle, the Schlag am Hürtgenwald. Schlag am Hürtgenwald, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, which I think is an episode that, when you look at the sort of period after Overlord, is one of those battles that sort of kind of gets a bit of hand-waving. Oh, God, that's awful. There's this awful battle in the Hürtgen Forest. Oh, it's terrible. And then he's overshadowed by the events of the Battle of the Bulge.
Yes. And preceded, I think, also by the events of Market Garden.
Exactly. So we thought what we should do is look at this extraordinary story. I mean, it's the second longest land battle the US Army fought, isn't it, in the Second World War?
In Europe. Yeah.
In Europe. So it's quite the event.
Oh, it really is. And when it comes to kind of grimness, brutality, awful conditions, the enemy being every bit as bad as the enemy, if you see what I mean, being the landscape. This is it. And also it's that, the Hürtgen Forest it conjures up images of, I don't know, it does to me anyway, kind of 30 years war and, the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. It's the kind of, it's the pine, deep, dark wood.
That Gothic German imagination place, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yes.
It's dark, it's dense, there's, it's this incredible pine forest going up and down hills and there's little rivers and occasional fire breaks. But otherwise it's dark and, the light doesn't really get in and it's dark anyway because it's winter and it's just awful and miserable. And
bad place. I had a really interesting conversation one time being there, going and visiting and just the claustrophobia of the place and the darkness of it. And one of the people on the tour I was with at the time was in the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam and fought around the A Shau Valley, which the famous Battle of Hamburger Hill and all that. And he said to me, he said, this reminds me of the A Shau Valley. It's just a bad place where nothing good comes here. You're just like confined and dark. And it really struck me, the parallels, because I thought, that's why this was such a terrible battle, because it didn't take much to defend a place like that and to make it horrible. It already was, right? I mean, it's just, it's an awful place.
Spooky place.
So, I mean, it's interesting, Jim, that you dropped in Market Garden earlier there, because in a way, this offensive or the beginnings of this battle are from the same time and kind of the same mood music that sets Market Garden in motion, isn't it? So it's at the start of the battle on the 11th September, or the genesis of it. It's the 11th September, 6:15, 85th Recon Squadron, the 5th Armored Division. They send 6 men on a patrol and they go into Germany. Near Stolzenberg in Luxembourg, in the heart of the Ardennes and east of Bastogne.
Yeah, so that's actually quite a bit further south from that Hürtgen.
Yeah.
You've got that northern bit with Holland, which is the Reichswald and all that. Then you've got further to the south, you've got Aachen, which is the great historic city. It's where Charlemagne was crowned. It's where Charlemagne the Great is buried. It's got this, it's got oodles of history about it. It's a tremendous cathedral. It's just inside the German border. So it's the first sort of great German city to be confronted by the Allies. Then south of that, you've got this massive, a number of forests. It's not just the Hürtgen Wald, it's plenty of other Walds beside, or Walden, I suppose you would say. It gets labeled as one as Hürtgen. Then below the Hürtgen forest, then you've got the Ardennes. So the crossing of the 85th Recon Squadron, and it's only 6 men in this little patrol, that's a little bit further south. But my point is, they're right up against the German border now. This is the Siegfried Line. This is the West Wall. And there's this sense that all the momentum is with them. The Germans can't possibly organize themselves into a decent defense, even though there's Dragon's Teeth anti-tank stuff, concrete and bunkers and pillboxes and all the rest of it of the Siegfried Line. They seem at first glance to be rather under-defended. And there is this general mood of high expectation, confidence, a sort of belief that, one last push and they're kind of over the line and the war's over. And there's this great quote from Major William Sylvan, who is General Hodges' ADC, Courtney Hodges' ADC, from the 6th of September. And he says, the general said tonight that given 10 good days of weather, he thought the war might well be over as far as organized resistance was concerned.
Gosh.
And this is the atmosphere in which these decisions, whether it be Market Garden, whether it be to attack Aachen, whether it be to push on through the Hürtgen forest, are being made. And, the thing about the battle for the Hürtgen forest is we know it turns into this ghastly, awful slogging match in this hellhole of an area in which to fight a modern battle in the fall of 1944. But just take yourself back and, there is this, everyone's impatient. We've talked, you and I particularly, Al, have talked so much about the impatience to get on with the war. They're in a hurry and get it done, because the sooner you get it done, the fewer people get killed. And then you can turn and pull full weight on Japan and all the rest of it and get that over and done and everyone could go home. So obviously it's a balance, but how could you not be optimistic after the huge successes of the Normandy victory, followed by that incredible advance, which outstrips the German advance in May 1940, but in the other direction? I mean, back in May 1940, that was the most astonishing advance of armies ever in the history of warfare, and the Allies have just beaten it. So, of course, they're feeling optimistic. My own view is I think that's entirely understandable. We should probably give the senior commander a little bit of a break on that kind of, if there's a little bit of overconfidence creeping in, I think that's understandable.
And the other thing is that, remember, there's a generation of officers who experienced the fall in 1918 when Germany did collapse in November of that year, kind of unexpectedly.
Yeah.
And so I think many of them felt a sense of deja vu.
Yes. The autumn's coming. They're falling in on themselves. The July plot fits into this too. It looks like the army might take control of the government, all that sort of stuff. But they're wrong, unfortunately.
Let's just say that. But this area, John, this is U.S. First Army. And U.S. First Army was the one that was commanded by Bradley, Omar Bradley for D-Day, that came across 29th Infantry, 1st Big Red 1, 1st Infantry Division. But it's grown, and other armies have grown as well. There's now the 9th on their left flank on their northern side, and there's, I guess, 3rd Army below them, and
7th Army below them, and
7th Army below them. So then you've got the 2nd Army, British Army, and then the 2nd Canadian Army. So, the 6 armies. Took us through the 1st Army and what they've got here.
Yeah, the 1st Army is our largest of Army-level formations in Europe at this point. Like you said, Jim, it's the original. It's commanded by Courtney Hodges, who had been sort of groomed and cultivated for command of this to succeed Bradley. And Hodges has a kind of an interesting background in that he had once been a private. So he ascends to become a general. He's a very reliable guy. He's really been a kind of a, like the U.S. Army schools system, like the infantry school at what was Fort Benning, Command and General Staff College, so on and so forth. Hodges has been a star in that environment, and I think that's really what has propelled his career on some levels. I don't know that he has quite distinguished himself as a commander, an actual commander in the field. Now, he elicits loyalty from his staff. There's no question. You mentioned Major Sylvan before. Sylvan, keeps a fascinating diary. He and another officer in 1st Army headquarters, which is a really good source for us now. And you do see there's an allegiance to Hodges and an admiration for him. So he certainly has something to recommend him, but he's not really an innovative thinker.
He's a technician, isn't he?
He's a technician. He's not a lead from the front guy. And not like you have to be, I suppose, as an army commander, but I do think it helps. I think most of the successful ones, like Patton, tend to lead from the front so much as they can. This is, I think, something of the tragedy of what's happened in the South Pacific. Honestly, it's linked to it because Robert Eichelberger probably would have commanded First Army if not for MacArthur doing all of his machinations to keep him. And I think probably First Army is going to be better led and more innovatively. And I'm not saying Hürtgen Forest doesn't happen, but maybe it doesn't happen in the same way. Hodges just isn't the guy.
But Hodges has been absolutely crucified for this. He's just one after another. Narrative historians have just laid into him and said he was awful, unimaginative, boring, humorless, all the rest of it. But by late 1944, you're not commanding the biggest army in the ETO without some merit.
No doubt.
You're not.
No, he's got plenty of merit. Just whether he's up for this particular task is the question, whether he ought to be in command.
They've done very well in Normandy. They've done very, admittedly he's taken over from Bradley, but they've done very well in the breakout. I mean, a lot of the work that destroyed the German army was more achieved by the First Army than it was by the Third, for example.
All right. In Normandy,
Isn't the issue here really embarking on this campaign in the first place? Once you're committed, again, what else can you do? And it has that inexorable logic to it, doesn't it, this campaign? You're just drawn in further and further and further, and there's that sort of kind of commitment, sunk cost thinking that goes into it.
Well, the other problem with this, and I think this is one of the reasons why Market Garden is worth the punt, is that the whole of the Siegfried line, the whole West Wall, is just a horror story from an attacker's point of view. It doesn't matter which way you look at it. It's awful. There's mountains, there's woods, there's forests, there's rivers, there's dams, there's natural lakes. You get through one horrible river, there's another one. There's the Reichswald. There's Aachen. No one wants to fight in a big city, which is one of the reasons why they kind of sort of try and get around it and isolate it. So, what do you do? It's all very well saying, that you shouldn't go into a dense forest, but the whole border's kind of full of dense forests. So it's kind of, the whole Eifel region, which I guess the Hürtgen forest falls into and stretches down into the northern part of the Ardennes. It's all forest, it's all rivers, it's all hills and windy roads and inaccessible, etc. That's why it's a border region. And just to kind of make it even worse, it's got, in this stretch alone, kind of 3,000 pillboxes, dugouts, dragon's teeth, wire, mines galore, blah, blah, blah.
But nevertheless, the Americans think it's not being properly held. For all these fortifications, they think, right, well, there's an opportunity here. There's a chance here. And
there clearly is as well, I would say.
There is. Yeah. I don't have any issue with them probing in to try this. I mean, like you said, the Siegfried line is an empty shell. And Germany really is teetering, well, then by all means, let's put maximum pressure on and move. But what my issue is doubling down on this when it doesn't work, later. Sure. Now I'm talking like by November. But so it's certainly worth the throw at this point, isn't it? Let's see what 100%. They've got. Let's see if you can get through here.
Yeah. So let's just quickly look at what they are trying to do. So the primary goal at this point, so we're talking about the kind of middle of September. And the primary goal is to kind of get to the Roer River, the Roer River, not the Ruhr, not the Rhone. It's not the Rhine. It's the Roer. It's all very complicated.
You say Ruhr, I say Ruhr.
Yeah, exactly. Well, anyway, the Roer River.
Let's call the whole thing off.
This starts in the Ardennes, heads through the town of Monschau, which is near the Belgian border, and then eventually joins the Meuse. But, it's another big river that you've got to get across, and it's a pain in the backside from an attacker's point of view. Intelligence officer at First Army, so First Army's front is 35 miles, basically, from near Aachen down to the Ardennes. So this is the stretch. Aachen is right at the top of it, and then you're getting into Ninth Army above them, above Aachen. And intelligence officers have warned of a series of dams, particularly the Schwammenau and the Urft. What a great name for a dam. And that controls the flow in the Ruhr River. But the problem is if you attack through this forest and you're getting towards the Ruhr River and suddenly the Germans decide to kind of break these dams, and you've got a massive flooding problem and you're stuck there and isolated there. So, that has been flagged up. But again, there's this issue that everywhere you go, there's, there's rivers, dams, lakes, whatever, so it's worth the punt. I don't think the dams, which again has been one of the kind of big criticisms of this, is the issue. As you say, John, it's the doubling down that's the issue.
Yeah.
And there is this feeling that it needs to be taken, but south of Aachen is this 70 square miles of forest, the Hürtgen forest,
Yeah, what do you do with it? I mean, there's a reason they fortified this part of their country, isn't it? I mean, because building pillboxes and bunkers and dragon's teeth there and all the rest is going to, basically redouble already difficult terrain for any kind of attacker, any kind of maneuver army, any kind of close air support.
Yep.
So that's definitely going to be a tough one to crack if they've manned it. Yeah. I mean, that's the question here. So there's no issue reconning it, which they're going to. And in the initial phases of the Battle of Hürtgen, it's the 9th Infantry Division that really is going to carry the main role. And they've done a lot of hard fighting in Normandy and all the way from North Africa, of course. The Octofoil Division, it's really an amazing unit.
Yeah, I've got a soft spot for the 9th, I've got to say. Because of their role they played in Sicily and North Africa. And, they've been around the block, and they tend to be the forgotten primary infantry division. They're a permanent division as well. They're not a National Guard one, are they?
Right. They're a regular army division. They're going to fight in Vietnam, for instance, like in the southern part of the country. And so they don't exist today. So that's one thing that's different about them versus the 1st and the 3rd, which are, the other two really top drawer infantry divisions. Like you said, Jim, they kind of get shunted aside in our popular memory, yet they do a lot of really key fighting in Normandy. That is going to be obviously a major reason why the Allies win.
Hodges meant to say facing the same problems as well that everyone else on the Allied broad front is facing. They're at the end of their supply lines, aren't they? The lines of communication are really, really stretched. Everything's still coming from the Mulberries or direct from Omaha Beach. So everything's taking ages to get there. In the era of air supply, truck supply, this whole thing, keeping things going. So even
Red Ball
if you
Express.
Exactly, the Red Ball Express. So even if you are able to sort of formulate what you're going to do, you're limited in what you're able to do in terms of your logistics side of stuff. And also, everyone's exhausted. They've been worn out units, which are either like full of people who've probably had a belly full or replacements who don't know what they're doing quite yet. So there's a peculiar blend, isn't there, that doesn't necessarily lend itself to taking a quick initiative, which is what sort of needs to happen here. Because after all, if the Germans, as you say, John, if the Germans have fortified it to be manned, it isn't manned just quite at this moment. But the minute they get wind that there's something coming, then it turns into a perfect piece of defensive ground. And as we've seen defending, and Jim's talked about this an awful lot in Italy, is that defending offers that antagonist the initiative of defense in that you don't have to make any decisions. You just have to work out your lines of fire, zero your artillery, and off you go. The initiative is then handed to the Americans. And if they haven't quite got everything running match fit, then it's going to be more difficult for them, right?
Yeah, well, and it's always easier to defend, and this is another classic example. It's incredibly difficult to attack, especially against an enemy who has pretty sophisticated artillery capability, which really, I would argue, that's the great German asset at this point. I mean, their infantry have been beat to crap, obviously, and they've lost so many people, they're having serious manpower problems, but it doesn't take that many people or that many tubes in order to put out a lot of firepower, especially when it's being multiplied by the terrain in a forest area. So I would say we tend to overlook this because the Germans obviously are having critical, like existential manpower problems. But you know what? The U.S. Army is having serious manpower problems by September 1944. And this is sort of the beginning of that. Like we said, with the 9th Infantry Division, like you said, Al, it's a mixture now of people who have had enough and then new guys thrown into the mix. And you've got companies that are under strength. So that presents challenges because an attacker needs that manpower advantage, and not just a matter of bodies, but a matter of understanding combined arms and coordinating routes of advance and all this kind of stuff. So I think this becomes the problem going forward, is the whole thing is a manpower suck. And at the macro level of our war effort, we've invested a lot of our human resources into technological, aerial, sea power, all of this kind of stuff. And so now we need ground power here as you get into this kind of situation. I think that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, that's a really, really, really good point. I think what we should do is we should just make sure that everyone's absolutely clear about where we are and the forces involved. We've talked about kind of, First Army and all the rest of it. So this is an area which is kind of due west of Cologne. So you've got the cities of Dusseldorf, Cologne, then Bonn, all in Western Germany, in that kind of sort of border region. And I guess this is kind of 40 miles west of that, 50 miles west of that. It's that kind of neck of the woods.
And on a line of latitude with Brussels, Aachen, isn't it? So
yes.
Yeah. So directly east of Brussels is Maastricht, and then Aachen is a little further east. And then the Hürtgen forest is sort of a saddle that runs kind of right to left.
Yeah, what was that? Southwest to northeast. Yeah.
Yeah, on a diagonal.
And very
exactly.
little development, very little infrastructure and road net, too, is the other issue.
Yeah, it's primitive.
Yeah,
then First Army is divided into 3 corps, not 2. So you've got 19 corps, which doesn't really particularly come into this battle. It gets involved in the Aachen battle, but not really the Hürtgen Forest battle. Then you've got 7 corps. This is Lightning Joe Collins, who we've talked about before, who was in Guadalcanal at the end of the Guadalcanal campaign. Moved back over to European theatre, was 7 Corps commander in Normandy, did really well, absolutely made strides at Operation Cobra, which was, the big breakout battle in the last phase of July 1944. And he's pretty competent, and he's a thruster, and he's a dynamic character, and he absolutely is at the front, and he's still only in his mid-40s, I think. He's quite young.
He was the youngest guy in the class of 1917.
So there you go.
He's quite young.
So that's the 4th Cavalry Group, the 1st and the 9th Infantry Divisions, and the 3rd Armored Division. And then you've got 5th Corps, also in Normandy, which is Leonard Giraud, which is 102nd Cavalry Group, 4th and the 28th Infantry Divisions, and the 5th Armored Division. Yep. And it's 7 Corps that's the kind of taking the heat in the initial moves on this, both on Aachen and in the Hürtgen Forest. And, as you're saying, there is this belief that the troops opposite are low grade, the German troops, that they're service and second line troops, known as SOS troops.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with good reason.
Yeah.
Because it's an emergency. Well, and there's laying hands on anybody they can get, regardless of age or whatever. But it doesn't take much, does it, to put you or me in one of these bunkers and the machine gun or something? Gun.
Yep.
Some kind of weapon and say, just shoot at whoever moves out there. The terrain and the fortifications do much of the work for you. So if you're willing to do that, you can become quite formidable. Same in an urban combat settings. And that's what we're worried about in Aachen. Yeah. So this is what I think is interesting about Collins. He has an amazing career, of course, but I would say, with the possible exception of, all the crises he deals with once you have the Korean War going on, this is really the low point of his career, because at Guadalcanal, he had done an amazing job as commander of the 25th Division, really inflicts a knockout blow on the Japanese there, and it gets him noticed to redeploy to Europe. He leaves the Pacific, by the way, because he thinks it's going to be an airman's war, just a matter of airfields on islands, and he doesn't think there's much there for a ground commander. I think he's wrong in the broad sweep of things, but that's how he saw it. So he gets this corps, 7th Corps, and obviously distinguishes himself in Normandy. Like you said, Jim, he's definitely a thruster. He's really aggressive. He will one day become Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army during the Korean War, and so he's dealing with that. But this Hürtgen Forest thing is so anathema to what Collins is all about, that he gets...
no movement and thrusting here.
Tar pit. Yeah, exactly. You can't thrust much, can you? And he's not generally blamed for it, because it's really Hodges, it's his design, I suppose. But this is not a distinguished moment for Collins either, at any level of this. But he's obviously in at the beginning, when 7th Corps is tasked with reconning the forest and getting a sense of how it could be a formidable objective.
But he's also thinking, he thinks that Aachen's on his watch. He's hoping to take Aachen quickly. He thinks he can do it. He thinks the way to do it, there's these hills to the southeast of Aachen, and he thinks he can bypass it and go in, below Aachen, really, and sort of isolate it. No one wants to get stuck in a big urban battle for obvious reasons. Yep. So this is the kind of sort of what's considered to be the sort of gap between the two, isn't it? Below Aachen towards... I don't know. What's the nearest town? I suppose it's
Stolberg, and the whole Stolberg corridor would be the key to any advance, I've always thought. Obviously, the enemy is deciding on this too, because initially the more rational people on the German side are thinking, well, we'll evacuate Aachen and we'll defend at the rivers. And then Hitler gets involved in his usual inimitable way and decides, no, we're defending every street in Aachen. And so whether Collins likes it or not, he's going to have to get involved in an urban battle there. Yeah. I think 19th Corps fights a smart battle in the sense of enveloping Aachen and trying to seal it off, rather than get involved in an endless urban struggle there. This is just one thing that Collins is dealing with the fringes of it, Aachen, in addition to Hürtgen Forest. So again, we're kind of overstretched, I suppose, if we think about it from that point of view.
Because it's the big red one going into Aachen, isn't it?
Eventually. So you'll have the enveloping battle in which the big red one will be involved in some of those fights east of town, like Crucifix Hill and all that. Yep. And then the 30th Division is coming from the other side, and you'll have that link up But the actual fighting in Aachen is done by 2 battalions from the 26th Infantry, the Blue Spaders of the Big Red One. And I think it's one of the most remarkable things. We can, do another episode on that sometime. It's its whole story. But so that's happening like in the mid-October. So this is happening alongside this plunge into Hürtgen that we're finding already by October is becoming pretty tough. The 9th Division is finding that out. And they really paid quite a price there. I mean, what's the casualties, like 4,500, something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, that's really kind of staggering when you think about it. That's more than a regiment.
Yeah. Right. Well, we're going to take a very quick break and then we'll be back. The battle should start, shouldn't it, dear listener?
Yes.
In classic We Have Ways style. We'll see you in a tick. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, Al Murray, James Holland and John McManus. And in the first half, we laid out the background to the battle in the Hürtgen forest. And already we've done what we should never do and said it's going to be ghastly, but it is going to be ghastly, isn't it? We've rather laid our cards on the table here. And I think, John, we're going to get some home truths from you about what you think of how various people perform in this encounter. I mean, one of the interesting things about this is that the Americans, with their broad front approach, there is a debate, isn't there, about what are you in Germany to do? Destroy the enemy or take places. And this is one of those things where we'll bypass a place, we'll bypass Aachen, and we'll destroy the enemy where we find him. And that's our job. That's the role of the army. And a broad front thing is to encounter the enemy, find him where he is, and perform your enormous cani as, the glittering prize in Eisenhower's mind, isn't it? In every general's mind, as Eisenhower says, is for an envelopment and it's a grand encirclement. And this battle is an attempt to not get hung up on a place that then gets hung up on a place.
Yeah, that's the irony of it.
The sort of horrible irony of it. And in the end, if somewhere's defendable and the enemy had prepared to dig in and fight to the bitter end, you have got a massive problem if you're attacking, whether you've got fresh formations or, as we've said, the Americans have got this situation where, they've suffered the sort of friction and wear and tear of the whole summer's campaigning and now into the autumn. So they're not as sharp as they might be for this task. Again, this is the phase of the war where the Germans are very much into defending and very much into not giving an inch one way or another. We say it's Hitler saying Aachen must be defended, but certainly the rank and file feel like that too, don't they? Or at least fighting like they feel like that.
A lot of the people from there, especially.
Yeah, in particular.
I mean, so we're running into this, like you said, Al, all the above, but also at the time when both East and West, the Germans are proving resilient enough to have enough in place to start to plug the holes in the line and at least continue the war. Yeah. And in part because the Allies are dealing with logistical issues. I mean, the road net absolutely stinks in northern France because of the transportation plan, which helps isolate the Normandy beaches and battlefields. But now we're paying that price on the other end. So I think that takes away from our capabilities on some level. If we're thinking like from a First Army standpoint, I don't know that we have the kind of combat power that we really need in order to plunge into an objective like the Hürtgen Forest, that the Germans don't have to put a whole lot there in order to cause issues, because mines are a serious problem through the whole campaign, and that's a force multiplier. And artillery, as I mentioned earlier, I think is the key to this whole thing on many levels. And then they have enough people they can throw into good defensible positions on ridge lines and near gorges, and obviously in Siegfried line positions or whatever, that it really doesn't take much. And also, First Army is not particularly innovatively led by Hodges. Now that adds to our problem. I'm not saying his divisions in the Corps we were talking about are hollow divisions. They aren't, but they're diminished. Maybe that's a better way to put it for this particular task.
Well, the 9th certainly is. And the
so
replacements they've taken on have only just joined them. And you finish the Normandy campaign in the kind of third week of August. Then you're on the charge. Then you're pausing for a couple of weeks as you're kind of nearing the German border. Then you're taking a whole lot of replacements on. You haven't had a chance to kind of absorb those replacements properly. They haven't sort of had a nice sort of easy stint on the line where they're kind of not doing an awful lot, but sort of getting the lay of the land. It's sort of straight in. And, the first probing attacks are out in the second week of September. This is the 3rd Armored Division, and then the southern units of the Big Red One. And then the main attack begins with the 9th Infantry Division, as we mentioned, south of Aachen. The aim is to take the village of Schmidt, which is on the kind of far side of the Hürtgen Forest in the north, and Monschau to the south. And this is a stretch that's not it's not a huge distance or anything. And to reach the Ruhr River, it's about 15 miles. So again, you can see why it all seems quite doable when you know that the enemy have beaten. But, initially they do pretty well, don't they? I mean, they do achieve surprise and they make some progress. I mean, the 47th Infantry, which is one of the 3 regiments in the 9th Infantry Division, it takes Schevenhütte, which is on the northern fringes of the forest, sort of on a line with the town of Schmidt. But because they've had so many hits over the last few months, they are just really, really lacking manpower. That, as you say, they're a diminished division, not at full strength. And they can't really press home that advantage. And that allows the Germans to kind of regain their balance.
Yeah, exactly. The 275th Infantry Division, which becomes the main adversary initially. I mean, later on, they're going to have an armored division involved. But that's the other thing, too, that's ironic. I mean, our armored divisions might as well be on the moon on some levels because you just can't maneuver vehicles at any great level. So I'm not just talking about tanks. I'm talking about the half-tracks, which is the bulk of your combat power, the armored infantry. So it's just really bad terrain for that. And if you're logistically diminished too, let's think about the macro side of this too. I think it's worth pointing out, this is just one forest of several that we're dealing with. If we go far enough south, we've got the Vosges that we're dealing with for 7th Army. And if we're talking about the Ardennes, right, in Luxembourg, I mean, we're dealing with that
forest,
too.
Again, a patchy forest.
Another one, and it's the exact same time frame. So if you think about it, like from the big theater point of view, Hürtgen is just one of several. So we don't quite know what we're getting into on that sense. We all know how it turns out as historians. At the moment, though, maybe it isn't quite as clear, from that kind of higher level, what Hürtgen's capabilities are in terms of bogging us down and opportunities for the Germans to really bleed us.
Well, the 275th is, you're looking at about 6,000 men, something like that. It's not very strong. It's got attached to it just 6 self-propelled guns. It includes men of the 20th Luftwaffe Fest Battalion who have no military experience whatsoever.
And the Luftwaffe Interpreter School. I mean, imagine you're good at languages, right? And you think, brilliant, right? I'm good at languages. I don't have to man an anti-aircraft gun. I've not got to be the tail gunner in some goddamn Dornier or whatever. And you think, excellent. All I'll do is I'll translate Allied ciphers for my boss, listen to the radio, and everything will be fine. And then, of course, they're pressed into frontline combat.
I know.
I mean, poor bastards.
What a buzzkill, huh?
Obviously, they surrender because they would, wouldn't they? And they know how to, of course. They can say, we surrender, can't they? They can do it in English.
They don't even have to worry about handy hawk, right? I mean, it's just we surrender.
so they're okay. It's a transferable skill in times of crisis, being able to speak English.
But the 275th have got a fairly determined commander, General Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, not to be confused with the town of Schmidt, which is the Americans' objective. And, he's not going to give up without a fight. And it's all about hunkering down behind the trees and manning your machine gun posts and your mortar pits and sniping, tries to do a little bit of sort of hate propaganda to them all. So there's 30 minutes of training every single day of hate propaganda. The NCO will bark at the men, every shot must kill the Jewish Bolshevik. And the answer is every shot.
Every shot.
And then the NCO then goes, kills the British swine. And
every
the answer
shot
is
must kill.
Every shot must kill.
Which made me think, what if it's an American? Oh, he's okay. I don't know. Did they amend it? Are there American swine? I mean, we need some love here, don't we? I mean, come on.
But they're able to hold on. Schmidt's guys are able to hold on because we've spent kind of all year talking about Italy and the advantages and disadvantages of fighting in Italy. They're the same here. It's the same issues, isn't it? The terrain is this multiplier for the defender and the bad weather. And I think this is one of these things where you fall off the edge of the traditional campaigning season, which after all affects air power as much as it affects anybody else. Mm-hmm. For all its modernity, you fall off the edge of the old campaigning season, and 6 self-propelled guns are worth 50. If you can't do anything about them, if you can't interdict them from the sky, do ground attack on them, they're worth their weight in gold, aren't they? That's the thing. Yeah. 9th Division attacks along the Hoffen-Alzen Ridge, and 39th and 60th Regiments meet heavy resistance to push back. Actually, to be pushed back, 39th Infantry then captures Lammersdorf, but can't dislodge the enemy in the woods beyond the village.
And let's remember, these are regiments that are used to gaining ground. These are can-do units that have succeeded from North Africa forward. So for them to be pushed back like that, it really kind of tells us something. And we've just talked about how the Germans, this is not high quality manpower. It doesn't take much.
No. And I should just say that if you look on Google Earth and you look at Lammersdorf, you can see the thick, dense, dark wood all around it. And little things come up saying, Bunker Hürtgenwald, and then there's another Bunker Hürtgenwald, and then yet another Bunker Hürtgenwald. So, and then you can see Monschau, Westwall. So it's, it's all there. Just makes me want to get in the car and go over, I've got to say.
I wish it was that easy for me. Yeah.
I mean, the thing is that the Germans are getting hammered, though, as well in all this, aren't they? That's the thing, is that they are underarmed, they're undermanned, but they're hanging on. So, Hodges kind of has mixed messages, doesn't he? From the Germans he captures, he knows that they're being interrogated. He knows that they're under strength. He knows that they're hanging on by a shoestring. But nevertheless, so he thinks, well, how hard can it be? This is one more heave and we should be okay.
Yeah, how's he going to know otherwise without trying?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And really at this stage, when you look at the pattern, what's happening in this first phase of the Hürtgen battle, it's very similar to what's happening in the Vosges at the same time. We're running into these sharp fights here and there, getting pushed back here and there, or, not advancing as quickly as we want, but also we are advancing. And we're wondering if we're going to reach that point where the Germans just don't have any more. Obviously, then you continue on. But we don't know that at this stage. It's a feel-out kind of thing, I guess.
Yeah. And at the same time, the Aachen battle's going on. Hodges is spinning several plates. But that's the other thing, isn't it? Is that had he had the weight to concentrate on one or the other, the results would have been quite different, wouldn't they? Aachen would have probably fallen sooner, or the Hürtgen battle would have been concluded more quickly. But he hasn't. He can't do it, can he? He's got too much to juggle.
With a 35-mile front, you're going to have that.
Yeah, exactly.
And it most definitely is a broad front strategy by now.
So come the 8th of October, the Arbeits Battalion are sent to join 275th Infantry, and they're all old men. And they're wiped out, basically, on their first day in action, aren't they? Luftwaffe Officer Cadet Battalion is also wiped out. 275th Division are losing, by October the 9th, they've lost 550 people. So they're really getting it. They are really, really getting a kicking.
There's a great line from Schmidt. The commitment of the old paterfamilias was painful.
Basically, all the old guys they've wheeled into action. It's awful, from a police battalion. And again, you come to thinking, look, if you're doing this by now, what's going to be left? You're going to chew through your kids and your grandparents, and you've already killed all your men in between. What's going to be left of the country? By the 10th of October, there's very heavy rain, and the Germans are therefore able to stabilise the line because of the weather. This is a sort of autumn into winter pattern. That's a thing that then happens from now on, really. More reinforcements come in, and
that's yet another training school that's been cut short.
I mean, you're learning on the job, aren't you? It's horrendous.
Yeah.
And that's a Lehr regiment, who are officer candidates in charge, led by Oberst Helmut Wegelein. They launched an attack on the 12th of October, 0700, supported by artillery, smashed up by the American artillery in return. So, I mean...
the counter battery fire there is just whatever the Germans can help, Americans can help sort of 8 times back.
Definitely.
I mean, that's...
Yeah. But the Germans sort of call all this off on the 14th, but it's been enough. Again, it's enough to wear out. 4 days in combat, whichever way you're going, forwards or backwards, is really, really hard going, isn't it? Is the point. So 9th Infantry exhausted as well in dealing with this. No matter how effective these German attacks are, piecemeal or otherwise, they're wearing and slowing down Hodges' men.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the 9th Infantry Division, its operations in the Hürtgen, they're halted on the 16th of October, which is exactly a month after they've begun on the 16th of September. And in that time, they've suffered 4,500 battle casualties and non-battle casualties as well, of course. That's effectively half your fighting strength.
Yeah.
If you think in a sort of 15,000 man infantry division, about 9 to 10,000 are fighting troops and the other 5 to 6,000 are support troops or whatever. That's a huge hit. And basically, that's one casualty for every yard that you've captured. And when you're putting it in those kind of terms, it doesn't really feel like it's working.
And I'd be willing to bet that 90% of those casualties are in the infantry regiment rifle companies, probably. So that only adds to it. But I'll tell you, one thing that occurred to me in studying this, I kind of wish the Germans had continued with what they were doing at this stage of launching these counterattacks against us, because I think then that would not have been to their advantage. Because, look what was happening. Look how many people they were losing here and how our artillery could just slaughter them. What happens, unfortunately, instead, is they're going to hunker down. And then we got a problem because now we're attacking all the time and we know what kind of casualties that means. And as I said, they've got artillery. As long as they have artillery, I mean, that is really what matters most, I guess.
Well, yeah, and I think this is the key point here and this is the point that you were making a short while ago, John, is that all the potential problems of fighting through the Hürtgen forest are laid out on a plate by the 16th of October by the time the 9th Infantry Division are pulled out. I mean, all the problems they faced, they're just going to be repeated by the next lot that comes in. And again, don't want to overkill the comparisons of Italy, but this is a problem with Monte Cassino. When the 4th Indians take over from the Red Bulls, they're on the same line and the same thing's going to happen and the same constraints are in the way. So they might be fresh troops, but the fresh troops are going to suffer exactly the same problems that the now exhausted and, debilitated troops have suffered. Nothing's changed. It's not just one more push and it'll work, because, that's the strategy of the First World War on the Western Front, and it doesn't. If it's not working and what you're doing is you're funneling infantry into a meat grinder, then you need a plan B, and you need a plan B very quickly, because this isn't working.
Definitely.
This is really the point at which Hodges shoulda, woulda, coulda, but this is the point at which he has an opportunity to think again, right? What direction is he getting from above, if any?
Well, the direction from above is gain ground, move east, get on with it, collapse these guys. And of course, all this has happened in the context, obviously, of Market Garden's failure. So, and everything that has cost us logistically in terms of not having Antwerp, and then all the momentum that's going to cost our armies. And of course, too, I should point out, Patton's Third Army is now involved in the Metz fiasco, so it's more or less the same kind of thing happening there. So everywhere the story is the same. So Hodges' pressure is basically to keep moving and gain ground. And it's very unambiguous, I suppose.
And it's just that this landscape doesn't really work for a modern, highly technological, mechanized army, where you are trying to use steel, not your own flesh. And there's these sudden plunging valleys, narrow valleys, and radios don't work. And, there's trails and fire breaks, but they're indistinct. And it's incredibly easy to lose your sense of orientation in these places, regardless of whether you've got a compass or not. It's clear that loads of people are just going out on patrol and getting completely lost. When they're advancing, they're getting completely lost. I mean, this is properly dense forest, pine forest.
The manpower suck.
Many people are then finding that they're depending on their own artillery to find their way back to the lines.
Yes, that's amazing.
And there's even cases where people are calling up a single artillery round on a particular point to help the men reorientate themselves. I mean, that's crazy. And you've got men leaving foxholes at night, and then getting disorientated, even if they stray kind of, 100 yards or so, 75, 100 yards.
And you could even go in there today, you can see how it would happen, because you're there for 20 minutes and you're like, where am I? How the hell am I getting out of here? What is this around me? And that's just today. Imagine.
Yeah, and a compass only tells you north, south, east, and west. It doesn't tell you where you are.
No, really doesn't. And like maps, what kind of maps do we really have to know where we're going? And so basically this terrain negates all our advantages of maneuver, air power, technological power, communications power, even firepower on some levels, because we're not able to use as much in the way of our vehicle firepower. And obviously that's maneuver too. So it really just one weapon that it comes down to. What we've got as an equalizer, it's artillery, but then eventually infantry's got to gain ground. So the puzzle pieces are all out on the table for Hodges here. And I think the issue that I think many of us have with him is he doesn't step back and say, no, this isn't how the puzzle should fit together. Maybe there ought to be a way to skirt around this. And admittedly, it wouldn't have been easy. And you could be looking at a fatal funnel on either side of the Hürtgen forest, I suppose.
And there are also weapons now which have been developed, which are incredibly cheap to manufacture, which are incredibly easy to put in the way of any advance. And this we're talking about tripwires and mines and of course mortars and machine gun on fixed positions. But I mean, where there's trees, that's something to tie a tripwire around. And the soft forest floor enables you to kind of lay vast numbers of mines incredibly quickly. And everywhere you go, the Americans are just running into these mines. They're running into their tripwires. Men are having their feet blown off. They're being obliterated. It's just too easy to find yourself in a kill zone, isn't it?
It's an engineering problem.
Yeah. So it's turning into a combat engineer assault problem, but a very dense one. I mean, I think one of the points in the notes, Jim, you make is that if you end up with people on patrol, they aren't looking around, they're looking down, because they're looking for tripwires, they're looking for shoe mines. Yeah. And so even your ability to patrol is curtailed or hampered by this kind of hazard, let alone whether there are any mines there or not. It doesn't matter. You end up in a situation where you're in a paranoid state where they're everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And in a place where visibility is limited anyway. Yeah. Even if you were looking around. So one of the most poignant images of the Hürtgen forest as a whole, but really this phase of the battle, is how engineers are operating either with pitchforks ahead of themselves, or more commonly down on hands and knees, very gently with their bayonets probing around. Even that isn't going to do it for you if we're talking about these stacked mines with their tripwires. And a tripwire in a forest environment? Really? Seriously? all the thickets and the leaves. And I mean, how are we really going to determine that? And if it's dark and it's rainy, so really you're talking about it most effectively from an engineer standpoint, it would have to be bulldozers with armor, explosives and all that. But think of how exacting that is and how dangerous it'll be if the enemy is opposing you and artillery and all that. You get a sense of the problem, I think, when you think about it from that sense.
Yeah. But it's also just incredibly wet. I mean, that's the other thing. Wet. And, a forest can be a good place to be when it's raining because it acts as a kind of a giant umbrella, but not when it's consistently rained. You just get dripped on. And, weapons are going rusty. Ammunition is going rusty too. Leather boots are rotting. Trench foot becomes a major problem.
The Germans have these same problems too and aren't as well appointed as the Allies in terms of materiel. So
no, it's just that, but they are in defense rather than attacking, I suppose, at this point.
They can hunker down in a bunker, I guess, and it's miserable, but it's not quite the same in terms of trench foot, I suppose. But I
mean, again, we come to that. You start to ask how on earth do the Americans keep people going in this set of circumstances? You can see what's keeping the Germans going. We've talked about the more bloodthirsty end of the political indoctrination, but here you are actually defending the fatherland in this instance, one way or another. Whereas if you're from Boise, Idaho, what the hell are you doing here?
What am I doing here? Yeah.
What's this for? What's the point?
This is just my opinion. To your question now, I think this is the time in World War II when we in the U.S. Army get the closest to the idea, like in World War I, the coercive, we're going to push you out into no man's land and we've got herders who are going to do this and don't think about turning around or we'll shoot you kind of thing. I mean, not that happens in the Hürtgen Forest, but I think that's the closest we come to it in this war that I can think of. Very coercive from quarters on down, and a serious discipline problem at times. I think it's amazing anybody went forward as things develop. But I think that becomes the mentality, especially in the 28th Division, by the way. I think that's where you see this the most. And a level of bitterness that will be there among the survivors that is not analogous to anything I've seen in another battle.
We've basically got to the end of October 1944 of the Battle of the Hürtgen. There's an opportunity here to call it off, but they don't.
Yeah, and so just imagine what November's going to be like, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if we've laid it on thick enough.
You think you're depressed now? You ain't seen nothing yet.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
It's going to get way worse.
It's going to get a whole load worse.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for listening. This was the first part of our Battle of the Hürtgen Forest series. If you want to listen to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA or We Have Ways of Making You Talk in its naked form, then go to our Apple channel, become officer class, and you won't need to tolerate the adverts. And you can listen to them in subject order and binge to your heart's content. Or even better, join our Patreon, become a patron where you get immediate access to things like this all in one go. And of course, the dates for We Have Ways Festival 2025. I'm not going to say when. That's still secret, isn't it, Jim?
Yeah.
John, have we told you yet when it is?
No.
That's how secret it is, ladies and gentlemen.
That's impressive operational security. I'm proud of you guys.
So there you go. Anyway, thanks everyone for listening. We look forward to bringing you part 2 of the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. Cheerio.
Cheerio for now.
See ya.